The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Victoria Matthews against the wooden side panel hard enough to bruise her shoulder, and she knew with absolute certainty that the three men riding alongside were not there to welcome her to Nevada City, California. She clutched her worn carpetbag tighter, feeling the outline of the small derringer her mother had pressed into her hands back in Boston just weeks ago. The driver's nervous voice filtered through the canvas covering as he spoke to someone outside, his words too muffled to understand, but the fear in his tone unmistakable. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, sweat trickling down her spine despite the October chill of 1872 seeping through the coach walls. She had traveled nearly 3,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, fleeing circumstances in Boston that had left her with no other choice. And now it seemed she might not even make it to her destination alive. The canvas flap ripped open, and a man's weathered face appeared, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Well now, what do we have here?" His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty little thing, aren't you? Where you headed, sweetheart?" Victoria pressed herself against the far side of the coach, her throat too tight to form words. She had known the journey west would be dangerous, but the reality of it was far worse than anything she had imagined during those long nights in her cramped Boston boarding house room, reading and rereading the letters from Harold Peterson, the merchant who had advertised for a wife and promised her a new life in California. "I asked you a question," the man said, his voice hardening. He reached in and grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward. The carpetbag fell from her lap, spilling some of its contents across the coach floor. "Please," she managed to whisper, "I'm just traveling to Nevada City. I'm expected there." The man laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You hear that, boys? She's expected." He pulled harder, and Victoria stumbled out of the coach, nearly falling to the dusty road. Two other men sat on horseback nearby, their faces shadowed by their hat brims. The stage driver sat frozen on his perch, his hands raised, his face pale. "Now, we've had a bit of bad luck at the card tables lately," the man holding her wrist said, his grip tightening until she whimpered. "And I'm thinking a pretty girl like you might help turn our fortunes around. There's a place in Sacramento that would pay good money for. Let her go." The voice came from behind them, calm and steady, carrying the kind of authority that made even the man holding Victoria pause. She turned her head as much as she could and saw a lone rider approaching on a paint horse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road. The rider was tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown jacket and a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. "This ain't your concern, friend," the man holding Victoria called out, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Just ride on." The rider came closer, and Victoria could see him more clearly now. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something steady about him, something that made her want to trust him even though she had learned long ago that men were rarely what they seemed. "I'm making it my concern," he said, bringing his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. His hand rested casually on his thigh, but Victoria noticed it was very close to the revolver holstered at his hip. "That lady looks like she doesn't want to go with you, which means you're going to let her go." "Right now." The man holding Victoria laughed again, but it sounded forced this time. "You planning to take on all three of us, Cowboy? Those are mighty poor odds." "I've faced worse," the stranger said simply. His eyes met Victoria's for just a moment, and something in them made her believe him. "Besides, I'm thinking you boys are the type who are brave when it's 3 against 1 woman, but might not be so eager when the odds are more even." The tension stretched out like a wire pulled too tight. Victoria's wrist throbbed where the man held it, and she could feel him weighing his options. The other two men shifted on their horses, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. "Last chance," the stranger said, his voice dropping lower. "Let her go, or we'll see how fast you boys really are." Something in his tone must have convinced them, because the man holding Victoria suddenly released her wrist and stepped back. "She ain't worth dying over," he muttered, trying to save face. "Come on, boys. Let's find easier pickings elsewhere." The three men mounted up and rode off toward the east, throwing dark looks over their shoulders but not slowing down. Victoria stood in the middle of the road, trembling so hard she thought her legs might give out. The stage driver let out a shaky breath and slumped in his seat. The stranger dismounted and walked toward her slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "You all right, miss?" Victoria tried to answer, but her voice wouldn't work. The fear that had been holding her rigid suddenly released its grip, and she felt tears burning hot trails down her cheeks. She hated crying, especially in front of strangers, but she couldn't seem to stop. "Hey now," the man said gently, stopping a respectful distance away. "You're safe, they're gone." "I'm sorry," she managed to say, wiping at her face with shaking hands. I'm not normally." "You just had a bad scare," he said, his voice kind. "Nothing to apologize for. Let's get your things back in the coach, and we'll make sure you get to Nevada City safely." He retrieved her carpet bag from inside the coach, carefully gathering the items that had spilled and placing them back inside without examining them too closely, which Victoria appreciated. When he handed it to her, she noticed his hands were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. "Thank you," she said, finally finding her voice properly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." His expression darkened slightly. "Best not to think about it. You heading to Nevada City to meet someone," Victoria nodded, clutching her bag. "Yes, a Mr. Harold Peterson. We've been corresponding and he's expecting me." Something flickered across the stranger's face, gone too quickly for her to identify. "Harold Peterson, the merchant." "Yes, do you know him?" Before he could answer, the stage driver called down from his perch. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I need to get moving if we're going to make Nevada City before full dark. Are you all right to continue?" Victoria looked at the coach, then at the road ahead, and felt a fresh wave of fear wash over her. What if those men came back? What if there were others like them waiting along the road? She must have looked as terrified as she felt, because the stranger spoke up. "I was headed to Nevada City myself," he said. "I'll ride alongside the coach, make sure you get there safely." "You don't have to do that," Victoria said, though the relief she felt at his offer must have been written all over her face. "I want to," he said simply. He held out his hand. "Name's Matthew Walsh. My friends call me Matt." She shook his hand, feeling the strength and warmth of it. "Victoria Matthews. Most people call me Victoria." "Well, Miss Victoria Matthews, let's get you to Nevada City." He helped her back into the coach, his touch gentle but steady, then mounted his paint horse and positioned himself alongside the coach as it started moving again. Through the small window, Victoria could see him riding easily, scanning the road ahead and the hills on either side. She tried to settle back against the uncomfortable seat, but her mind was racing. In the span of an hour, she had nearly been abducted and been rescued by a stranger who was now escorting her to meet the man she was supposed to marry. A man that Matthew Walsh apparently knew, based on his reaction to the name. She wondered what he had been about to say before the driver interrupted. Did he know Harold well? Was there something she should know about her intended husband that the carefully worded letters had not revealed? She had so many questions, but the rumble of the coach wheels and the pounding of her own heart made it impossible to think clearly. The sun was sinking lower on the horizon, painting the California hills in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful country, so different from Boston with its brick buildings and crowded streets. Out here, the sky seemed to go on forever, and the air smelled of dust and sage and possibilities. Or at least, it had seemed full of possibilities back when she had made the decision to become a mail-order bride. Now, she was not sure what to think. The coach began to slow, and Victoria looked out to see buildings coming into view. Nevada City spread out before them, a collection of wooden structures clinging to the hillsides, remnants of the gold rush that had built this place 20 years earlier. The main street was busy with people going about their evening business, saloons already lit up, the sound of a piano drifting through the air. The stage pulled up in front of a hotel, and the driver climbed down with a groan. Matthew was already off his horse, opening the coach door and offering his hand to help Victoria down. She accepted, grateful for the steadiness of him as her legs adjusted to solid ground after so many hours of travel. "Thank you again, Mr. Walsh," she said, smoothing her skirts with her free hand. "I don't know how I can repay your kindness." "No repayment needed," he said, though he looked troubled about something. "Miss Matthews, about Harold Peterson, Victoria Matthews." They both turned to see a man approaching from the hotel entrance. He was in his mid-40s, Victoria guessed, with graying hair and a prosperous-looking waistcoat stretched over a comfortable middle. His face was pleasant enough, round and clean-shaven, with small eyes that assessed her with what might have been satisfaction. "Mr. Peterson," Victoria said, her stomach nodding. "Indeed, indeed." Harold Peterson reached them and took both of Victoria's hands in his, which were soft and slightly damp. "My dear, you're even lovelier than your photograph suggested. The journey wasn't too taxing, I hope." "There was some trouble on the road," Matthew said quietly. "3 men stopped the stage." Harold's eyes widened. "Good heavens! But you're unharmed, my dear." "Yes, thanks to Mr. Walsh," Victoria said, glancing at Matthew. "He intervened and escorted the stage the rest of the way." "Walsh," Harold said, his tone cooling considerably as he looked at Matthew properly for the first time. "I see. Well, I suppose I should thank you for your assistance, though I'm surprised to see you back in Nevada City. I thought you preferred keeping to your ranch these days." There was an undercurrent to Harold's words that Victoria did not understand, a tension between the two men that seemed to go beyond simple acquaintance. Matthew's expression had gone carefully neutral, revealing nothing. "Just doing what anyone should do when they see someone in trouble," Matthew said evenly. "Miss Matthews was very brave." "I'm sure she was," Harold said, though he was barely listening. He had already turned his attention back to Victoria, still holding her hands. "Come, my dear, I've arranged a room for you at the hotel. You must be exhausted. We can discuss our wedding plans tomorrow after you've had a chance to rest." Victoria felt pulled in 2 directions. Part of her wanted to go with Harold, to fulfill the commitment she had made when she accepted his proposal by letter. But another part of her, a part she did not quite understand, wanted to stay near Matthew Walsh, the quiet cowboy who had saved her and made her feel safer than she had felt in months. "That sounds very sensible," she made herself say. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." "Please call me Harold," he said, patting her hands. "After all, we're to be married in just a few days. No need for such formality." Matthew touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be going then. Miss Matthews, I hope everything works out well for you." "Wait," Victoria said, the word escaping before she could stop it. Both men looked at her. "I mean, Mr. Walsh, will you be in town? I'd like to thank you properly, perhaps." "I'm sure that won't be necessary," Harold interrupted smoothly. You'll be quite busy with wedding preparations, and I'm certain Mr. Walsh has his own affairs to attend to. Isn't that right, Walsh? The two men locked eyes for a long moment. Then Matthew nodded slowly. That's right. Good evening, Miss Matthews, Peterson. He mounted his paint horse and rode off down the street, and Victoria watched him go with a sinking feeling in her chest that made no sense at all. Harold guided her into the hotel, keeping up a steady stream of conversation about the town, his store, the nice people she would meet, the comfortable life they would have together. Victoria tried to focus on his words, tried to feel grateful and excited about this new chapter of her life. But her mind kept drifting back to storm gray eyes and a calm voice saying, "You're safe with me." The hotel room Harold had arranged was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. He left her there with promises to call on her in the morning, and Victoria finally found herself alone. She sank onto the bed, every muscle in her body aching from the long journey and the fear and the confusion of the day. She thought about Boston, about the life she had left behind. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving debts that had consumed everything they owned. Her mother had passed just 6 months later, worn down by grief and worry. Victoria had tried to make it on her own, working as a seamstress in a shop that paid barely enough to cover her rent in a boarding house that was one step above a slum. When her employer had started making advances that grew more aggressive each week, she had known she needed to escape. The advertisement for mail-order brides had seemed like providence. Harold Peterson's letters had been respectful and proper, promising a comfortable home, security, and companionship. He had not promised love, but Victoria had not expected it. She had hoped only for safety and a fresh start, and that had seemed like more than enough. But now, standing in this strange room in this unfamiliar town, about to marry a man she had just met, she felt more uncertain than ever. And she could not stop thinking about Matthew Walsh. The next morning, Harold arrived early with a woman he introduced as Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, the wife of the local banker and apparently Nevada City's leading authority on proper social conduct. Mrs. Fletcher was a handsome woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that assessed Victoria from head to toe in about 3 seconds. "Well, she's certainly pretty enough, Mrs. Fletcher announced as if Victoria were not standing right there. "A bit thin, perhaps, but we'll remedy that. Good breeding shows in the bones. Where did you say your people were from, dear?" "Boston, madam," Victoria said, trying to match the older woman's brisk tone. "My father was a banker before his death." Mrs. Fletcher's expression warmed slightly. "Respectable profession. Good. Harold, I'll take her to the dressmaker this morning for her wedding dress. The ceremony is planned for Saturday, yes." "That's correct," Harold said. He had been watching Victoria with a proprietary air that made her uncomfortable. "Just 3 days away. I see no reason to delay, do you, my dear? 3 days." The reality of it hit Victoria like a physical blow. In 3 days, she would be married to this man. In 3 days, her entire life would change irrevocably. "No," she heard herself say. "No reason to delay." Mrs. Fletcher swept Victoria out of the hotel and down the street, maintaining a running commentary on the town and its inhabitants. "That's the assayer's office, though business isn't what it used to be now that the big gold finds are mostly played out. The church is up on the hill, very nice. Reverend Thompson is a fine preacher. And that's Walsh's ranch, out past the edge of town, though we don't see much of Matthew these days." "Matthew Walsh," Victoria said, trying to sound casual. "Mr. Peterson seemed to know him." Mrs. Fletcher's lips pursed. "Oh, they know each other all right. Used to be partners in the store years back. Had a falling out over some business matter. Matthew took his share and bought that ranch, been out there mostly by himself ever since. Shame, really. He's a good man, but he's let himself become isolated. They were partners, Victoria said, surprised. That explained some of the tension she had sensed between them. Ancient history, dear, Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. Here we are, the dressmaker. The next few hours passed in a blur of fabric swatches and measurements and discussions of lace versus ribbon. Victoria went through the motions mechanically, nodding and agreeing when it seemed expected of her. The dressmaker, a quiet woman named Sarah, had kind eyes and gentle hands and seemed to sense Victoria's distress. "It's normal to be nervous," Sarah said softly as she pinned the hem of a blue calico dress that Harold had insisted on purchasing. "Marriage is a big step, especially to someone you're just getting to know." "Did you know your husband well before you married?" Victoria asked. Sarah smiled. "I knew him all my life. We grew up together right here in Nevada City, but everyone's story is different. The important thing is that you're both committed to making it work." Were they, though? Victoria wondered. Harold seemed committed to the idea of having a wife, but she was not sure if he was committed to her specifically, or if she was simply filling a role he needed filled. And what about her? Was she committed to Harold, or just to the idea of security? That afternoon, Harold took her on a tour of his store, which occupied a prime location on the main street. It was well-stocked and clearly profitable, with everything from mining equipment to fine fabrics to imported tinned goods. Harold introduced her to his clerk, a young man named Tommy who looked at Victoria with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "Once we're married, you'll help manage the household," Harold explained as they walked through the aisles. "I've hired a housekeeper who comes in 3 times a week, but I'll expect you to oversee the meals and the general running of the home. I entertain business associates regularly, so you'll need to be a gracious hostess." "Of course," Victoria said. It all sounded reasonable enough. It was what she had agreed to, after all. So why did she feel like she was slowly suffocating? They were walking past the general store's front window when Victoria saw him. Matthew Walsh was across the street, loading supplies into a wagon. He moved with an easy efficiency, muscles flexing under his work shirt as he hefted a sack of grain. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met through the glass. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then Harold's hand was on her elbow, steering her away from the window. "Let's look at the kitchen goods," he said. "I've been meaning to upgrade some of the cookware." That evening, Victoria sat in her hotel room and tried to write a letter to her friend Catherine back in Boston. She started 3 different versions and crumpled them all up. How could she explain what she was feeling when she did not understand it herself? She was about to achieve exactly what she had set out to do: marry a prosperous man who could provide her with security and comfort. She should be happy. She should be grateful. Instead, she felt like a bird watching a cage door swing closed. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found the hotel clerk holding a small package. "This was left for you, Miss Matthews." Inside the package was a book, the leather cover worn but well cared for. Sonnets from the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. There was no note, but tucked inside the front cover was a single wildflower, already beginning to dry. Victoria's heart began to race. She knew, without being told, who had left this gift. She opened the book to a random page and read, "I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death." She sat down heavily on the bed, the book clutched in her hands. This was impossible. She could not have feelings for Matthew Walsh. She had only met him yesterday. She was engaged to marry Harold Peterson in 3 days. This was absurd, impractical and completely inappropriate, and yet her heart was singing. The next day was Thursday, one day before her wedding. Victoria woke with a sense of urgency, though she could not have said what exactly she urgently needed to do. Harold had business to attend to and would not be calling on her until the afternoon, which left her with several hours to herself. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, a deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. She told herself she was not trying to look pretty for anyone in particular, that she simply wanted to look presentable while exploring the town. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror did not believe her. Nevada City was smaller than Boston but bustling with activity. Victoria walked slowly down the main street, taking in the mix of rough mining town and attempts at civilization. There was a theater, currently advertising a melodrama called The Drunkard's Doom. A Chinese laundry occupied a narrow building, with delicate characters painted on a sign she could not read. The smell of fresh bread drew her to a bakery, where a woman with flour-dusted hands sold her a sweet roll and directed her to the nicest parts of town. Victoria found herself walking uphill, following the directions more by instinct than intention. The houses here were larger, more established, with actual gardens and painted fences. And at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country, she saw a ranch spread out against the hillside. The ranch looked well-maintained but modest, with a sturdy house, a barn and corrals holding several horses. She could see cattle grazing in the distance. It was beautiful in its simplicity, honest in a way that made her chest ache. "You're a long way from the hotel, Miss Matthews." Victoria spun around to find Matthew leading his paint horse up from a creek that ran along the property line. He was dusty and clearly had been working, but he looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she forgot to be embarrassed about being caught near his ranch. "I was just walking," she said, "exploring the town. I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he said. He tied the horse to a post and walked closer. "How are you? After the other day, I mean." "I'm fine, thanks to you," Victoria said. Then, because she could not help herself, she added, "Thank you for the book, it's lovely." He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to send it, but I thought you might like it." "I do," Victoria said softly. "Very much." They stood there, 3 feet apart but the distance feeling like both nothing and everything. Matthew cleared his throat. "Would you like to see the ranch? It's nothing fancy, but—" "I'd love to," Victoria said before he could finish. He showed her around, pointing out the various buildings and explaining his plans for expansion. He had 200 acres, he told her, and a small herd of cattle that he was building up gradually. He did most of the work himself with the help of one hired hand who came a few days a week. "It's not what I planned for myself originally," Matthew admitted as they leaned against a corral fence watching the horses. "I was going to be a merchant, build up the store with Harold, maybe become mayor someday. But after our partnership dissolved, I realized I didn't want that life. I wanted something simpler, more honest." "What happened between you and Harold?" Victoria asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "You're about to marry him," Matthew said quietly. "I'd say it's your business." He was silent for a long moment, watching the horses move across the corral. "We had different ideas about how to run the business. I wanted to keep prices fair, especially for the miners and the working families. Harold wanted to maximize profits. We argued about it for months, and finally, I decided I'd rather start over on my own than compromise on something that important to me." Victoria absorbed this information, thinking about the well-stocked store and Harold's obvious prosperity. "Do you regret it, leaving the partnership?" "No." Matthew turned to look at her directly. "But I regret some other choices I've made. Or rather, choices I didn't make. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What do you mean, Victoria?" he said, and the sound of her name in his low voice made her shiver. "I know I have no right to say this. I know you're engaged to Harold and the wedding is tomorrow, but I can't let you marry him without telling you, Matthew, don't," she whispered, but she did not move away. "I have to," he said, "because if I don't, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. From the moment I saw you yesterday, terrified but trying so hard to be brave, something in me recognized something in you. I know how that sounds. I know it's crazy, but it's true." Victoria felt tears prickling her eyes. "It is crazy, we barely know each other." "Then let me get to know you," Matthew said. "Call off the wedding, give us a chance." "I can't," Victoria said, though her heart was screaming at her to say yes. "I came here to marry Harold, he's counting on me. I made a commitment." "A commitment based on letters," Matthew said. "Not based on knowing him. Victoria, I'm not saying Harold is a bad man, but I am saying you deserve more than a marriage of convenience. You deserve someone who sees you, really sees you, and wants to know everything about who you are. And you think you're that person?" Victoria asked, her voice breaking. "After one day, I think I could be," Matthew said simply, "if you'd let me try." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling torn in two. Everything practical, everything sensible said she should walk away right now, return to the hotel, and prepare for her wedding tomorrow. Harold represented security, stability, everything she had come west to find. But Matthew represented something she had not known she needed. The possibility of genuine connection, of being seen and valued for who she was rather than the role she could fill. The possibility of love. "I need to think," she said finally, opening her eyes. "This is all happening so fast." "I know," Matthew said. "And I'm sorry for putting you in this position, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least tell you how I feel." Victoria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned and started walking back toward town, her mind spinning. Matthew did not try to stop her, but she could feel his gaze following her until she was out of sight. She spent the rest of the day in her hotel room, pacing and thinking and trying to sort through her tangled emotions. Harold called on her in the late afternoon as promised, bringing flowers and chatting about the wedding preparations. Victoria smiled and nodded in all the right places, but she felt like she was watching the scene from a great distance. That evening, she could not stand being in her room any longer. She slipped out of the hotel and walked through the town as twilight settled over the hills. The saloons were coming to life, piano music and laughter spilling into the street. She walked past them, past the stores closing up for the night, past the church where she was supposed to marry Harold tomorrow. She found herself at the edge of town again, looking out at the dark shape of Matthew's ranch in the distance. A light glowed in one window of the house. She wondered what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her the way she could not stop thinking about him. "Victoria!" She jumped and turned to find Harold approaching from the direction of town. He looked concerned and a bit annoyed. "What are you doing out here alone? It's not safe." "I needed some air," she said. "I was just walking." Harold's gaze followed hers toward the ranch and his expression hardened. "Has Walsh been bothering you?" "No," Victoria said quickly. "I just went for a walk, that's all." "I saw you going out to his ranch this morning," Harold said, and Victoria realized with a sinking feeling that he must have been watching her. "Victoria, I need to ask you something directly. Has Matthew Walsh been trying to turn you against me?" "Of course not," Victoria said, though it was not entirely true. "Because if he has, you need to understand that he's not thinking about your welfare," Harold continued. "Matthew is a dreamer, always has been. That's why our partnership failed. He'd rather make a noble gesture than a practical decision. Living on that ranch, scraping by season to season, that's not the life you want." "How do you know what life I want?" The words came out sharper than Victoria had intended. Harold's eyes widened slightly. "I beg your pardon." "I'm sorry," Victoria said quickly. "I didn't mean to be rude. I'm just nervous about tomorrow, I suppose." Harold's expression softened, though something calculating remained in his eyes. "Of course you are. That's perfectly natural. Come, let me walk you back to the hotel. You need your rest." As they walked back through the darkening streets, Harold kept up a steady monologue about their future together, the trips they would take, the position they would hold in society. Victoria listened and realized with startling clarity that he was trying to remind her of all the practical reasons she had agreed to marry him. He was trying to secure his investment. That night, Victoria lay awake for hours. She thought about her mother, who had married for love and ended up struggling for every penny after her husband's death. She thought about her father, who had loved his family but whose poor business decisions had left them destitute. She thought about the cold, hungry months in Boston, the wandering hands of her employer, the desperate loneliness of having nowhere to turn. And then she thought about Matthew's steady gaze, the way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, the simple honesty of his ranch and his life. She thought about the book of poetry and the dried wildflower, small gestures that showed he had been thinking of her, wanting to give her something beautiful. By the time the sun rose on Friday morning, her wedding day, Victoria had made her decision. She dressed carefully, packed her few belongings back into her carpet bag, and left the hotel. But instead of heading to the church, she turned in the opposite direction, toward the edge of town and the ranch beyond. Her heart was pounding as she walked up the dirt road to Matthew's property. The morning sun cast everything in shades of gold, and she could hear cattle lowing in the distance. She was halfway to the house when Matthew emerged from the barn, stopping dead when he saw her. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other across the dusty yard. Then Victoria said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I can't marry him." Matthew was across the yard in seconds, stopping just short of touching her. "Are you sure?" "Victoria, I don't want you to do this just because I'm not," she interrupted. "I'm doing it because I realized something last night. I came west looking for safety, for security, for someone to take care of me. But what I really need is someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. Someone who values the same things I value. Someone who makes me want to be brave instead of just safe." "Victoria," Matthew said, and this time he did touch her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "If you do this, it won't be easy. The ranch is just getting established. Money will be tight. It's hard work, and I'm not afraid of hard work," Victoria said. "I'm afraid of marrying someone I don't love and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd just been brave enough to take a chance." Matthew's face broke into a smile that transformed him, making him look younger and lighter. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified," Victoria admitted. "But yes, I'm sure." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her like she was something precious. Victoria buried her face in his shoulder and breathed in the scent of him, soap and leather and sunshine. She felt like she had been holding her breath for months and was finally able to exhale. "We should go talk to Harold," Matthew said after a moment. "It's not right to leave him waiting at the church." Victoria nodded, pulling back reluctantly. "You're right, though I don't think he's going to take this well." That turned out to be an understatement. They found Harold at his store, already dressed in his wedding suit. When he saw Victoria and Matthew walk in together, his face went through several shades of red. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "I'm sorry, Harold," Victoria said, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I can't marry you. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." "Not fair." Harold's voice rose. I've invested time and money in bringing you here. I've made arrangements, told everyone about my bride, and you're going to humiliate me like this." "I'm sorry about the embarrassment," Victoria said, "but surely you can see that it's better to call things off now rather than go through with a marriage that would make us both unhappy." "Make us both unhappy," Harold sneered. "I was perfectly happy with our arrangement." "This is Walsh's doing, isn't it? He's been poisoning your mind against me." "Matthew has nothing to do with my decision," Victoria said, though that was not entirely true. "I'm making this choice because it's the right one for me." Harold turned his fury on Matthew. "You couldn't stand to see me happy, could you? You've been bitter ever since I bought out your share of the business, and now you're trying to ruin my life." "I didn't buy Victoria here," Matthew said quietly. "And she's not a piece of property you can claim. She's a woman making her own choice." "A choice to throw away security and comfort for what? A hardscrabble ranch and a man with more pride than sense." Harold shook his head. "You're a fool, Victoria. When you come crawling back after you've realized your mistake, don't expect me to take you in." "I won't," Victoria said. "Goodbye, Harold." She turned and walked out of the store, Matthew beside her. Her hands were shaking, but her step was steady. Behind them, she could hear Harold shouting something about reputations and regret, but she did not look back. "That went about as well as could be expected," Matthew said once they were outside. Victoria surprised herself by laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. "I just destroyed my reputation, humiliated a prominent businessman, and threw away every plan I had for my future." "Having second thoughts?" Matthew asked, though his eyes were worried. "No," Victoria said, and she meant it. "Though I have no idea what happens now." "Now," Matthew said, taking her hand, "we figure it out together." The next few weeks were among the most challenging and most joyful of Victoria's life. The town, of course, had a field day with the scandal. Some people, like Mrs. Fletcher, refused to speak to her. Others, like the dressmaker Sarah, quietly offered their support. Harold made sure everyone knew his version of the story, painting Victoria as a fickle woman who had been led astray by Matthew Walsh's interference. But Victoria found she cared less about the gossip than she had expected. She was too busy learning about ranch life, about herself, and about Matthew. He courted her properly, insisting on it despite the fact that the town already assumed the worst. He took her on chaperone picnics, brought her flowers, sat with her in his modest parlor, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, come west as a teenager with his father who had died in a mining accident, worked his way up from nothing to build the ranch he now owned. She told him about Boston, about her parents, about the loneliness and fear that had driven her west. She told him things she had never told anyone, and he listened with that steady attention that made her feel truly heard. 6 weeks after Victoria had walked away from her wedding to Harold, Matthew asked her to marry him properly. They were sitting on his porch watching the sunset, and he took her hand and said, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Victoria Matthews, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, no hesitation in her voice. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married a week later by Reverend Thompson in a small ceremony with only a handful of guests. Sarah was there, and Tommy from the store, and a few of the ranch hands from neighboring properties who knew Matthew. It was nothing like the wedding Harold had planned, with no fancy dress or elaborate reception. Victoria wore a simple blue dress Sarah had helped her make, and carried wildflowers that Matthew had picked that morning. But when Matthew took her hands and promised to love and honor her for the rest of his life, looking at her with those steady gray eyes full of certainty and devotion, Victoria felt like the luckiest woman alive. Their first months of marriage were not easy. Money was tight, as Matthew had warned. The ranch demanded constant work, and Victoria had to learn skills she had never needed in Boston. Matthew taught her to ride, to help with the cattle, to manage the household accounts with careful precision. She taught him that his house could be more than just a place to sleep between work, adding small touches of comfort and beauty with the limited resources they had. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk and fell into bed exhausted each night. But Victoria had never been happier. Matthew was patient with her mistakes, celebrated her successes, and treated her as a true partner in every sense of the word. When she successfully delivered a calf for the first time, he was as proud as if she had performed a miracle. When a late frost damaged some of their hay crop, they sat down together and figured out how to make it through the winter. Winter came early that year, settling over the Nevada hills with an icy grip. Victoria and Matthew spent the long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from the small collection of books they had. Sometimes, Matthew played his guitar, a skill he had been shy about revealing, and sang old songs his father had taught him. Victoria learned to knit, producing slightly lopsided socks that Matthew wore proudly. In January, Victoria realized she was expecting a baby. She told Matthew over breakfast on a cold morning when snow was piling up outside. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she was laughing and begging him to put her down. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We're going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. Victoria was sick for the first few months, and Matthew worried constantly, bringing her weak tea and crackers, sitting with her when the nausea was worst. As her belly grew, the work became harder, but she refused to stop helping around the ranch entirely. They compromised, with Victoria handling the lighter tasks and Matthew hiring extra help for the heavy work. In September of 1873, almost exactly a year after Victoria had first arrived in Nevada City, she gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the town's midwife and Matthew, who held Victoria's hand and refused to leave despite convention saying fathers should wait elsewhere. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Matthew had tears running down his face. "He's beautiful," he said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger. "He's perfect." They named him James after Matthew's father and Michael after Victoria's father. Little Jamie, as they called him, had Matthew's gray eyes and Victoria's dark hair. And from the very beginning, he had a curious, determined personality that kept them both on their toes. Victoria took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she was overwhelmed at first by the constant demands of a newborn. Matthew was a devoted father, getting up in the night to help, learning to change diapers and soothe colic, singing the same songs to Jamie that his own father had sung to him. The years that followed were full of hard work, small triumphs, and the deep satisfaction of building a life together. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. They added more cattle, improved the pastures, built a better barn. Matthew's reputation for honest dealing brought him steady business, and gradually their financial situation became more secure. Victoria became known in her own right, not as the scandalous bride who had jilted Harold Peterson, but as a skilled rancher and a woman of integrity. She started raising chickens and selling eggs in town, which brought in useful extra income. She helped neighbor women with difficult births, drawing on her own experience. She was never going to be accepted by Nevada City's self-appointed high society, but she found she preferred the company of working people anyway. They saw Harold occasionally in town. He had married a widow from Sacramento a year after Victoria had left him, a woman who seemed to suit him well enough. The animosity faded over time into a kind of distant civility. Harold never acknowledged Victoria on the street, but he stopped spreading stories about her, which was good enough. When Jamie was 2, Victoria became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. In the spring of 1876, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. Rose had Matthew's smile and a sweet temperament, though she could be stubborn when she set her mind to something. Life settled into a rhythm. Winters were for planning and indoor projects, for teaching the children their letters and numbers by the fire. Springs were for calving and planting the kitchen garden Victoria had established. Summers meant long days of work, but also picnics by the creek and watching the children play. Autumns brought the harvest and preparations for winter, the satisfaction of full storage rooms and healthy livestock. It was not an easy life, and there were setbacks. They lost cattle to a harsh winter, struggled through a summer drought, worried through childhood illnesses and financial pressures. But they faced everything together, as true partners. On a cool evening in October of 1877, 5 years almost to the day since Victoria had first arrived in Nevada City, terrified and uncertain, she stood on the porch of the ranch house watching Matthew teach Jamie to rope a fence post. Rose was on her hip, babbling away in the mix of real words and toddler nonsense that passed for her conversation these days. "You're good at this, son," Matthew was saying, his voice full of pride and patience. "Keep your wrist loose, like I showed you." Jamie, his tongue poking out in concentration, tried again. The loop sailed wide and he laughed with frustration. "I'll never get it." "Sure you will," Matthew said. "Just takes practice. Your mama couldn't even sit a horse when I first met her, and now look at her." Victoria smiled at the memory. She had come so far from that frightened woman stepping off the stage coach, so terrified of the future. She thought about the choice she had made, the risk she had taken, and how it had changed everything. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, coming up onto the porch while Jamie continued practicing. "Just remembering," Victoria said, leaning into him as his arm came around her waist. "Thinking about how scared I was when I first arrived." "I remember," Matthew said softly. "You were trying so hard to be brave." "You said I was safe with you," Victoria recalled. "And you were right. I've been safe with you every day since." Matthew turned her to face him, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You made me brave too, you know. Brave enough to take a chance on something real instead of settling for what was expected." "We made each other brave," Victoria said, and kissed him while Rose squealed with delight between them. That night, after the children were in bed, Matthew and Victoria sat on the porch in the rocking chairs he had made, watching the stars come out over the California hills. Victoria's hand rested on the slight swell of her belly. She was pregnant again, though they had not told the children yet. They were hoping for another boy this time, though they would be equally delighted with another girl. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked quietly. "Choosing this life instead of the easier one you could have had?" Victoria thought about Harold's store and the comfortable house he had owned, about the social position and financial security she had turned down. She thought about the years of hard work, the calluses on her hands, the times they had struggled to make ends meet. "Never," she said firmly. "Not even for a moment. This is the life I was meant to have. You're the person I was meant to find." Matthew reached over and took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "I love you, Victoria Walsh." "I love you too," she said. "My brave cowboy who saved me." "We saved each other," Matthew corrected gently. And sitting there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the ranch they had built together, Victoria knew he was right. She had come west looking for safety, but she had found something infinitely better. A true partnership, a real home, and a love that grew stronger with each passing year. The stars wheeled overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear western sky, and Victoria felt at peace with all her choices. The frightened bride who had arrived in Nevada City 5 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, her own worth, and her own heart. In the years that followed, the Walsh Ranch continued to grow and prosper. The baby Victoria was carrying turned out to be twin boys, much to everyone's surprise and Matthew's delight. They named them Thomas and Henry, and they were as different as could be despite being born minutes apart. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful like his father, while Henry was adventurous and bold. Victoria and Matthew watched their children grow, teaching them to work hard, treat others fairly, and value honesty above all else. Jamie grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch and planned to expand it someday. Rose developed a talent for healing and spent time learning from the town's doctor, unusual for a girl but supported fully by her parents. The twins got into more mischief than seemed possible for two small humans, but they had good hearts. As the children grew older and more independent, Victoria found time to pursue her own interests. She started a small lending library in town, gathering books by subscription and making them available to families who could not afford to buy their own. She wrote letters to women back east who were considering the journey west, telling them honestly about both the challenges and the rewards. Matthew became a respected voice in the community, known for his fairness and his willingness to help neighbors in need. When new ranchers arrived in the area, he was always ready with advice and assistance. He served on the town council and helped establish a school that served the outlying ranches as well as the town children. They celebrated their 10th anniversary quietly, just the two of them riding out to the place where Matthew had first shown her the ranch. They spread a blanket under the same tree and shared a simple meal, talking about all they had built and all they still hoped to do. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Victoria asked, lying with her head on Matthew's shoulder. "After you showed me around." "I said a lot of things," Matthew replied, playing with a strand of her hair that had escaped its pins. "You said this ranch was simpler than the merchant life, more honest." Victoria lifted her head to look at him. "You were right about that too. Everything about our life together is honest, real." "It's the only way I know how to be with you," Matthew said simply. "You deserve nothing less than the truth, always." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds drift across the blue California sky. Then Matthew said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "About expanding into horses. Breeding and training, not just keeping them for ranch work. I think there's a market for good, reliable horses, and we've got the land for it." Victoria considered this, her practical mind working through the implications. It would mean more work, at least initially, and some investment in better breeding stock. "I know," Matthew said, "but the children are getting old enough to help more, and we've had a couple of good years. I think we could manage it if you agree." This was the partnership they had built, Victoria thought with satisfaction. Matthew did not make major decisions without consulting her, just as she always sought his input on her projects. They were truly in it together, for better or worse. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said. "Let's do it." The horse breeding operation started small, but under Matthew's patient training and Victoria's sharp business sense, it grew into a significant part of their income. Word spread about the Walsh horses, known for their steady temperament and reliability. Cowboys and ranchers came from as far away as Sacramento to buy stock from them. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays, by births and deaths, by the slow accumulation of memories that made up a life. Victoria's hair started to show threads of silver, and Matthew's temples went gray. But the love between them only deepened, tempered by time and trials into something unbreakable. When Jamie turned 18 in 1891, nearly 20 years after Victoria had first arrived in Nevada City, the family gathered for a celebration. The ranch was thriving, the children were all healthy and happy, and Matthew and Victoria could look back on 2 decades of marriage with pride and satisfaction. "I want to make a toast," Jamie said, raising his glass of lemonade. "To Ma and Pa. You've shown us what it means to build a life on truth and hard work and love. Everything we have, everything we are, comes from the example you've set." Victoria felt tears prickling her eyes as the other children echoed the toast. She looked at Matthew and saw her own emotion reflected in his face. "We've been blessed," Matthew said, his voice rough. "Blessed with good children, good land, and good fortune. But most of all, I've been blessed with your mother. She took a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense, and she's made every one of those dreams come true." "You did the same for me," Victoria said softly, reaching for his hand. "You gave me a home, a family, and a love I never thought I'd find." As the sun set over the ranch that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Victoria stood on the porch that had been rebuilt and expanded over the years, but still occupied the same spot where she had stood so many times before. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the fear and uncertainty that had driven her west, and the unexpected joy she had found. She had come to Nevada City as a mail-order bride, terrified and alone, seeking nothing more than safety and security. Instead, she had found a partner, a purpose, and a love that had sustained her through 2 decades of life's challenges and triumphs. Matthew came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Victoria replied, leaning back into his embrace. "You told me I was safe with you all those years ago. But you gave me so much more than safety. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave that to each other," Matthew said, and Victoria felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They had taken a chance on each other when it would have been easier to play it safe. They had chosen love over security, partnership over convenience, honesty over social expectations. And in doing so, they had built something rare and precious, a true marriage of equals, a love that had only grown stronger with time. As the years continued to roll by, Victoria and Matthew aged gracefully together, their love a beacon for their children and grandchildren. The ranch passed to Jamie eventually, though Matthew and Victoria remained active and involved well into their later years. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a celebration that brought together people from all over the county. Even Harold Peterson came, now a widower himself and mellowed by age, to shake Matthew's hand and wish them well. "You were right," he told Victoria privately, the first words he had spoken directly to her in 3 decades. "I was angry for a long time, but looking at you now, looking at what you've built together, I can see you made the right choice. I hope you've been happy." "I have been," Victoria said simply. "I hope you found some happiness too." "I had a good enough life," Harold replied. "Not what you have, perhaps, but good enough." As Victoria watched him walk away, she felt a sense of closure she had not known she needed. She had hurt him all those years ago, but she had made the right choice, not just for herself, but truly for both of them. Harold had needed a wife who could play a role in his life, not a true partner. She would never have been happy with him, and eventually, her unhappiness would have poisoned any chance they had at a decent marriage. Matthew found her standing alone, lost in thought, and pulled her onto the dance floor as someone struck up a waltz on the fiddle. They danced as they had at their wedding, with more grace now after years of practice at community gatherings, but with the same joy. "What were you thinking about just now?" Matthew asked as they swayed together. "About choices," Victoria said. "About how one brave decision can change everything." "Two brave decisions," Matthew corrected with a smile. "You were brave enough to walk away from what was expected. I was brave enough to tell you how I felt." "We've been brave together ever since," Victoria said, and kissed him to the sound of their family cheering around them. When Matthew passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1905, at the age of 62, Victoria felt like half of her soul had been torn away. They had been married for 33 years, partners in every sense of the word, and the loss was devastating. But as she stood at his grave surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and the community they had helped build, Victoria knew that Matthew's legacy was secure. He had been a good man, an honest man who had treated everyone with fairness and respect. He had loved her completely, supported her dreams, and built a life with her that had exceeded anything she could have imagined that scared day when she first arrived in Nevada City. Victoria lived another 12 years, remaining sharp and active almost to the end. She spent her time with her grandchildren, teaching them the same lessons about honesty and hard work that she and Matthew had taught their own children. She wrote down the story of her life, wanting future generations to know about the brave cowboy who had saved her and the love they had built together. On a warm spring morning in 1917, Victoria passed away in her sleep at the age of 66, in the same house where she had lived for 45 years. Her children found her with a smile on her face and Matthew's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, next to her own. They buried her beside Matthew under the oak tree they had loved, with a simple headstone that read, "Victoria Walsh, beloved wife and mother. She chose love and never looked back." And indeed, she never had. From the moment she had made the brave choice to walk away from safety and toward the unknown, Victoria had lived her life with purpose and passion. She had found a love that sustained her through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. She had built a family, a ranch, and a legacy that would continue for generations. She had arrived in Nevada City terrified and alone, a mail-order bride fleeing an untenable situation. She had left the world surrounded by love, having lived a full and rich life beyond anything she could have dreamed. And it had all started with a cowboy who had looked at her frightened face and said, "You're safe with me," then spent the rest of his life proving those words true. Their love story became legend in Nevada City, told and retold to new generations. The ranch remained in the Walsh family, a testament to what two people could build when they chose partnership over convention, love over security, and courage over fear. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Victoria and Matthew were together again, dancing under endless stars, their love story complete and their legacy secure in the hearts of all those who had been touched by their devotion to each other, and to the life they had built together in the wild and beautiful West.